Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Sephrodive, and it's time for another daily dose of March of the Machine spoilers. So, it's the weekend, that means it's a bit of a slow day spoiler-wise, but March of the Machines is so absurd. A slow day spoiler-wise means, oh, we just got a casual free 2020 trampler. This set is so ridiculous, and even though we don't have a million cards to talk about today, we should probably jump right into it, because these cards are so sweet. Before we do, two quick reminders. Number one, if you need some of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. And number two, if you want to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should mosey on over to mtgpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk March of the Machines. First up today, we got a casual free 2020, an Ancient Imperiosaur. So 7 mana 6/6, but it has Convoke, it has Trample in Ward 2, and it enters the battlefield with 2+1/+1 counters on it for each creature that convoked it. So if you actually think through what this means, it means if you have 7 creatures on the battlefield and you tap them all and cast this for 0 mana, Ancient Imperiosaur is going to come into play as a 2020 Trample Ward 2, a one-shot kill threat. So I think this card, a lot of people I've seen was like, oh, like, it's a random Timmy card, whatever. I actually think, though, the ceiling of this card is incredibly high. Just think about how this plays. Like, you're playing some, I don't know, green-white deck in Standard. Turn 1, you Skrelv. Turn 2, you Resolute Reinforcements. Turn 3, you play whatever 3-drop. Let's say Steel Seraph. Turn 4, you tap all 4 of your creatures. You pay 3 mana. You end up with a 3-mana 14/14 Trample Ward 2. That's a real threat. Because it has Trample, it's actually a really scary card. If you want to go even further, like, you can actually build this into just kill you on the spot. Maybe some sort of token deck with Mondrax and Wedding Announcements. We got ways to give it haste. Invigorating Hot Springs will just naturally give it haste because it's going to have counters. Goro for 1 mana gives everything haste. You can definitely build a deck with the idea being to just one-shot your opponent with an Ancient Imperiosaur. And because it has Ward, it's going to be a little hard to kill. Ward 2 is not unkillable or anything, but it is a form of protection. Like, if your opponent wants to go for the Throne or Destroy Evil at 2 of the most popular removal spells that could kill this, they're gonna have to have 4 mana available, and they might not see it coming. Like, who's gonna expect a hasty Ancient Imperiosaur coming down to one-shot kill them? Probably no one at this point. So I think Ancient Imperiosaur, the ceiling is really high. It's also a hilarious fling target. You can do the same stuff we were talking about, make it huge, and then Voldaren Thrill Seeker it, or Fling it, or Kazul's Fury it, or Thud it, which is hilarious. Also, probably one of the easiest ways to win with Mael's Area, one of our trickiest win the game cards. The challenge in Mael's Area is it's really hard to make a 2020 creature and not accidentally win the game. Plus, Area really wants you to go wide because it puts a counter on each of your creatures on the beginning of your upkeep, which is kind of nice. So if you can build a deck with all those tokens, get a creature to start getting counters on stuff, and then Ancient Imperiosaur is a 2020, all you gotta do is make it to your upkeep and you win the game. So before you think this is the most broken card in the history of Magic, there is a downside here, and this is the reason why the card probably isn't as broken as its ceiling makes it look. And the issue is, yes, it can protect itself, but if your opponent can kill your other creatures, this gets much worse. Like a 7 mana 6/6 Trample, that's actually just a bad card, even with Ward 2. That's not a playable card. Even if it's a 6 mana 6/6 Trample Ward 2, I guess it would be getting 2+1/+1 counters, so it'd be a 6 mana 8/8 Trample Ward 2. Even that's not very exciting. You really gotta be making this a 10/10, a 12/12, a 14/14, a 20/20 for it to be good. And think of it like Mono Green Devotion. If you've ever played against Mono Green Devotion in Explorer or Historic or in Pioneer, you're not going to stop them from doing their big thing, but what you can do is keep their cheap things off the battlefield so Nykthos isn't powered up, they don't have their mana dorks to ramp into their big stuff, so that's the best way to prevent that deck from going off. I think the same is true of Ancient Imperiosaur. If this ever takes off, the way to beat it is just keep the other stuff off the battlefield, and our standard is super removal heavy. There's tons of targeted removal, there's tons of sweepers, so I think that'll keep this in check. Like, after your opponent, like, you build this big board of tokens, and then your opponent brothers says that and sweeps them all away, you're going to just get stuck with this not very good Imperiosaur stuck in your hand. So Ancient Imperiosaur, I'm hyped for this card. I am definitely planning on building a one-shot kill, modify Hot Springs deck around this card, and I think it'll be really hilarious and awesome when it works. Just be warned, in a world where there's a lot of Brotherhood ends, in depopulates, in farewells, in targeted removal, there's a big risk that you build around this, and you're gonna have games where it just gets stuck in your hand, and it's the worst card in your deck, rather than that awesome one-shot kill threat. We also got a card I actually missed a couple days ago, but I wanted to mention in Kogla and Yidaro. Speaking of just massive, hasty threats that are going to deal a ton of damage, it is a 6-mana Gruul 7/7 legendary ape dinosaur turtle. When it ETBs, you either give it Trample and Haste and lend a turn, or it fights a creature you don't control, and then you can pay 4 mana and discard it to blow up an artifact and enchantment, shuffle it into your library, and you get to draw a card. So this is a mixture of Kogla Titan Ape, this is the huge creature ETB fight something, and also Yidaro Wandering Monster, which is the huge creature Trample Haste smash it for a ton of damage. I think this card is actually pretty scary. If you think about what this means, assuming you can cast it, it's always going to be good. If your opponent has a big creature, this is going to kill it. A 7/7 can fight basically anything that anyone's playing in Standard. It can even fight an Atraxa that's going to die, but still, it can fight down an Atraxa, so this can kill literally anything. So if you're behind on board, you can play this, fight down your opponent's biggest threat, and have a 7/7 left over. If you're ahead and looking to close out the game, then you just play this with Trample and Haste and smash your opponent for 7 and hopefully win the game on the spot. So that's a lot of flexibility. Cards that are good when you're behind and good when you're ahead usually end up being pretty good Magic cards. Plus you get the upside of this discard mode, which it is a little bit expensive, but it is uncounterable. It is instant speed. It does draw you a card, and we're in a Standard where there's a lot of really good artifacts and enchantments. Fable the Mirror Breaker, Wedding Announcement, Portal to Phyrexia, Reckoner, Bankbuster. So I don't think you're playing Kogla and Yidaro to blow up these cards, but it's a nice upside that if you're maybe a little stuck on mana, you can always just cycle this for 4 mana, blow up a Wedding Announcement, blow up a Fable the Mirror Breaker, and then put it back in your deck so you can draw it later when you have enough mana to cast it. I think we could build like a pretty interesting like Gruul haste ramp deck. Imagine just trying to ramp in the early game and then curving Uvenwald Oddity into Volatile Arsonist, into Kogla and Yidaro, into Tyrannus Rex. That is a lot of just hasty damage smashing at your face. Gonna be tough for some decks to deal with. Could also just be a fine mid-range threat, assuming you can cast it. It is double green and double red, but like I would play one of these in like Jund Windgrace. Windgrace does some ramping for you. This comes down, fights like the biggest ravenous chupacabra in the world, or just smashes for a ton of damage. We got 5-color Cammy War decks. The mana is good enough to make this work, so I actually think Kogla and Yidaro could be a Standard card. As a 6-mana legend, I don't think it's going to be a 4 of. I think it's going to be a 1 of, a 2 of, something like that. But this card offers so much value and enough flexibility that I think it's actually very Standard playable. Speaking of Standard playable, we got a pretty interesting Vampire Soldier 2-drop in Dusk Legion Duelist. So 2 mana, 2/2 Vigilance. And then when 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on it, you get to draw a card, but only once each turn. So Dusk Legion Duelist, I think this card actually has some potential. 2 mana, 2/2 Vigilance. Those are fine starting stats, although if you're playing this, your goal is going to be to add counters to it and draw those cards and make it into an even bigger threat. And once this gets big, Vigilance is very nice. You can swing and get in some damage and still have a big blocker back. One place this could work, and this is going to be interesting to see how it shakes out, is Soldiers in Standard. So it works super well with Siege Veteran, almost like these cards are built to go together. Turn 2 Dusk Legion Duelist, turn 3 Siege Veteran, counter on the Duelist, draw a card, make it a 3/3, hit your opponent. If it dies, you get a Soldier token. If nothing dies, you get to do it again the next turn and draw another card. The only question about Soldiers is, outside of Siege Veteran, the deck really isn't good at putting counters on things. That's not one of its main game plans. So we'll have to see if it's consistent enough to make it work. I guess the Lord you can exile from the graveyard to put counters on things. That's more of a fringe upside though. So does Soldiers have enough counter things? Is it worth it to add more counter synergies to the deck to power this up? What do you cut from Soldiers? But even beyond Soldiers, there's a lot of ways to put counters on this. There's many options. Like maybe there's a Boros Aggro deck where you're playing Kimano faces Kazan on turn 1. Turn 2, Dusk Legion Zealot, gets the counter from the Saga, draw a card, get a 3/3. Rafine's really good at conniving counters onto things. Teachings of the Kieran puts counters on things. Plus, we got all the new cards that are coming in March of the Machine itself. Archangel Elspeth. You play this, then you put the counters on it and send it to the air and draw a card. Tribute to the World, you're going to put counters on it. Invasion of Mog. Invasion of Mog's not very good, but we do have a +1/+1 counter theme in this set, so who knows what else we're going to get to support it. Another sneaky place to play this in older formats is in Vampire decks. So Vampires, you got Sorin, who's +1, puts a +1/+1 counter on a Vampire, so that's almost like Siege Veteran. Every single turn you can just draw an extra card and grow your Dusk Legion Duelist. Cordial Vampire also puts counters on things as your Vampires die. Similarly to Soldiers, is this enough +1/+1 counter synergies to beat out the other options? That's the real question. It's not like Vampires is a +1/+1 counter deck. They just have some incidental +1/+1 counter stuff in the deck beyond otherwise good cards. So we'll have to wait and see how that shakes out, but I think this card actually has a lot of potential. You also have like Hardened Scales. We got the new Hardened Scales coming to standard in the Ozolith, Luminarch Aspirant. So there's actually a lot of synergies for this card. So I think Dusk Legion Duelist, I think this card has a home somewhere, whether that is Soldiers or Vampires or a dedicated +1/+1 counter deck. I think this card offers enough upside. Its base rate is good enough and its ability is strong enough that we're going to find a deck to take advantage of this. So exactly where it fits is TBD, but I'm sure this card is going to have a home. We also have Deeproot Wayfinder, which this one, not all that excited about. 2 mana, 2/3, Merfolk Scout. When it deals combat damage to a player battle, surveil one, and then you may return a land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tab. So Deeproot Wayfinder, I don't think it does enough. Green is the worst color in Standard, so you're already kind of in a rough spot just because your color's not good. Maybe that'll change at some point, but the ability just seems too slow. It needs to deal combat damage to actually start ramping and surveilling, and we do have lands that work with it. We have Evolving Wilds, the Streets of New Capenna, Fetch Lands, Roadside Reliquary, Channel Lands. So there's a lot of lands to get in the graveyard. The question is, are you really going to be able to get in with a 2/3? Like, let's say best case, you play this on turn 2. If your opponent plays Blood Tithe Harvester or a Denic or a Graveyard Trespasser or a Corpse Appraiser or a million other things, this kind of just gets stonewalled and does nothing. So I'm actually very skeptical that this card's going to work. I thought for a minute, well, maybe this is a Merfolk card, but Merfolk, not a thing in Standard at this point. Maybe it will be once we get to Ixalan again, but in older formats, 2 mana is like the Lord slot, and there's no way you're cutting up Lord of Atlantis or Merfolk Mistbinder or Master of the Pearl Trident to play a 2/3 that might ramp if it gets in damage. So my guess is this card is a plant for the future. I think as of today, this card is pretty much stone unplayable, but remember, we're getting more Surveil support. We're going back to Ixalan. We are probably going to get more Merfolk support, so maybe this card looks a lot different after rotation in the fall, when we're going to have a whole new meta and presumably a bunch more cards that work with Deeproot Wayfinder. We also got a new Wrath in Sunfall. So Sunfall, 5 mana white sorcery, exile all creatures, incubate X, where X is a number of creatures exiled this way. So if there's much creatures, you're going to get a pretty big incubator that you can turn into a creature later. So Sunfall, on one hand, as far as the going rate to exile all creatures, this card is actually above the curve. I believe, unless I'm missing something, this is the first exile all creature cards that cost less than 6 mana. The old versions, you got Farewell, you got Final Judgment, you got Descend Upon the Sinful, they're all 6 mana. So if all you care about is exiling everything for as cheap of a rate as possible, Sunfall's like pretty good in that context. It also is kind of like a 2023 version of Phyrexian Rebirth. It very much reminds me of Phyrexian Rebirth. A Wrath from old Phyrexia. 6 mana, you blow up everything and get an XX Horror where X is the number of creatures destroyed. So you get a little callback there with the Incubator token. This is obviously less mana and exiling, which is an upside. So is Sunfall a playable card? And I think the answer is not right now. I think the problem in Standard is Farewell exists, and Farewell is just such a ridiculous card, especially in our current Standard, where there's a lot of artifacts, and there's a lot of enchantments, and there's a lot of stuff going on in the graveyard. Paying 1 more mana for that flexibility, I think means you're going to stick with Farewell over Sunfall, and then you're also kind of competing with Depopulate. Yes, Sunfall leaves behind to Incubate. Yes, it exiles rather than destroys, but it's also 1 more more mana. So if you're up against aggro, the difference between 4 and 5 is often going to be the difference between alive and dead. So I think it might just fall in an awkward spot right now, but I think this will probably change in the future. Both Depopulate and Farewell are going to be gone at rotation. So even though I don't think I'd play Sunfall over these options right now, there's a very good chance that this card will move up in the Wrath rankings quite a bit once they rotate. As far as Commander is concerned, there's just so many Wraths these days. You got OG Wrath of God. If you're gaining life, you got Fumigate. You got Winds of Abandon, which has some upside of being one-sided, but gives your opponent lands. You got Austere Command, Farewell, really flexible. Vanquish the Horde, often just going to be 2 mana. Where does Sunfall fit in this mix? And I would say, if you're just playing a generic good stuff deck, I think there's enough good white Wrath that you don't need Sunfall. Yes, exiling is mostly an upside. Yes, the Incubate is nice, but I think I would still just play either more flexible or cheaper Wraths over Sunfall. But I think we're at the point in Commander where you customize your sweepers based on your theme. So if you're playing, let's say Brimaz actively cares about incubates and Phyrexian creatures, then I think Sunfall would be in my deck. This is a nice upgrade for the Brimaz Precon deck. Yes, you could still play some of the other options, but Sunfall is going to be good. It's also flavorful, so I would play it there. Could also be in the conversation for some token decks where your incubate's going to be really, really big, and you probably have synergies like Anointed Procession to power up the incubate token even more. Then that's maybe a good option. In a token deck, this might be better than playing a Wrath of God or something. So I think it's something for very, very specific decks. So Sunfall, definitely an interesting card. Wait and see until after rotation and standard. Like, Farewell's just such a ridiculous card that I don't think this is beating it out, but it is definitely an interesting option. We also got another team-up legend in Zimone and Dina. So Zimone and Dina, 3 mana Sultai, legendary human druid. It's a 3/4. It says whenever you draw your second card each turn, target opponent loses 2 life, you gain 2 life, and then you can tap it, sack another creature, draw a card, you can put a land from your hand on the battlefield tapped. If you have 8 or more lands, you get to repeat the process once. So you would draw 2 cards, could put 2 lands into play. So Zimone and Dina, this is a mashup of Zimone Quandrix Prodigy, which is where we get the land synergies in the card draw, and then Dina Soul Steeper, which is where we get the drain in the sacrifice ability. So on one hand, it's a 3 mana 3/4, which is not horrible stats, but it's certainly not what it used to be. Like a decade ago, Rock's Warmonk was like kind of an exciting card because like, wow, it's a 3 mana 3/4 with lifelink, that's unbeatable. But now we're in a world where your 3 drops to be on curve, I think you're really looking for like 4 4s with upside rather than 3 4s with upside. This said, I mean, Zimone and Dina does tangle with some really popular threats in combat very well, like Blood Tithe Harvester not getting through, Corpse Appraiser not getting through, Graveyard Trespasser not getting through. So I don't think being a 3/4 is a deal breaker, even though it's no longer a selling point for the card. It's not like you see a 3/4 for 3 and you're like, whoa, above the curve, I gotta put this in my deck. It's more just like, okay now. So if this card is gonna be good, it's gonna be based on its abilities, and the abilities are actually kind of exciting. So we played a deck a while ago that was built around the Draw 2 theme, and it actually performed way better than I expected. So Zimone and Dina, it essentially has Gixin Puppeteer's ability. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, you drain for 2. Having multiples of this in your deck is really, really powerful, because if you're playing the Draw 2 deck, that's kind of what your deck's built to do. You're trying to draw 2 cards every turn to trigger these abilities. If you can stack up Puppeteers and Zimone and Dina, you're going to be getting a lot of drain going. It also works well with Gixin Puppeteer in the sense that when Puppeteer dies, you get to reanimate something mana value 3 or less, so you can get back your Zimone and Dina. We've seen this deck have some really grindy synergies, because Gurgling Anointer also reanimates stuff when it dies. So Zimone and Dina seems absolutely perfect for this deck. You can sack stuff to trigger your reanimation modes, and that's also going to draw extra cards, which is going to trigger your draw 2 stuff. So I think in this deck in specific, Zimone and Dina going to be one of the best cards in the deck. It's also kind of interesting with Shieldred. If you think about it, Shieldred wants you to draw cards to trigger Shieldred, and you're getting essentially a growth spiral if you sack a creature. So if you can build your deck in a way where you you have sacrifice fodder, maybe like Razorlash Transmogrant, which keeps coming back from the graveyard, maybe Persistent Specimen if you want to go deep, even just random dorks like Spirited Companion that do their damage with their ETB trigger rather than needing to stick out on the battlefield. That sacrifice for no mana to draw a card ability is really huge, and then eventually, as you are repeatedly growth spiraling, you're going to get up to 8 lands, and once you're drawing 2 cards every time you do this, then Zimone and Dina is going to take over the game really, really quickly. The only downside is, it is a creature that needs to sit on the battlefield. Doesn't really do anything right away, so it is apt to just, you play this and it go for the throats and dies. You play this, your opponent Liliana and it dies or whatever. You play this, your opponent Invoke despairs. So that is a drawback. Creatures that don't do anything right away can be a little bit sketchy, but if you keep this on the battlefield, it is a 3-drop that can pretty much just take over the game with its abilities. In the world of lower rarity cards, we got a few color hate cards that I think are worth mentioning because traditionally color hate cards end up being very good sideboard cards at a minimum. So we have changed the equation: 2 mana blue instant, counter target spell mana value 2 or less, or counter target red or green spell with mana value 6 or less. So this is a okay early game counter, like on turn 2, if you're on the play, you can counter your opponent's 2-drop. Not bad. That if you're up against a red or green deck, essentially just turns into a 2 mana hard counter. Like, that's going to get pretty much anything you could possibly want against a red or green deck. It reminds me a little bit of Aether Gust. Doesn't get rid of things on the battlefield, but Aether Gust has proven itself to be a sideboard all-star. I could see Change the Equation being roughly similar in standard. Like, I think if red and green decks become popular, this could be a reasonable sideboard option. In older formats, Aether Gust might be better, although it is worth mentioning, Change the Equation, it is a counter. Like Aether Gust, if you get rid of your opponent's important thing, they can just put it back on top of their deck, do it again the next turn. Change the Equation does get rid of it forever, so I don't know, maybe it's flexible enough to have some fringe implications in a format like Pioneer. We also got Surge of Salvation, a 1 mana white instant, says you and permanents you control gain hexproof until end of turn, so fizzling all the target removal to anything. Also, worth mentioning, you getting hexproof, pretty relevant against like Invoke Despair. Let's say this is 1 mana Invoke Despair counter. You just give yourself hexproof in response, keep all your stuff. That's kind of ridiculous. And it also says prevent all damage that red and black sources would deal to creatures you control this turn. So this card is a very good protection spell. If all you're concerned about is saving one creature, something like Lauren's Escape is probably better because you're also getting Indestructible and Scrying, but the fact that Surge of Salvation is going to mostly be a Lauren's Escape that also is going to be able to fizzle stuff that targets you like Invoke Despair means that this card could be a sideboard all-star in Standard. This also is very interesting in certain matchups. If you're up against decks with red and black creatures, the way this is worded, you prevent all damage that red and black sources would deal to creatures you control this turn. So what this means is, you got a big board of soldiers or mono white stuff, your opponent swings in with their Fable the Mirrorbreaker token and Shieldred and Bloodtithe Harvester, you can Surge of Salvation, you are free to essentially jump block, put your entire team in front of Shieldred, and you're not going to lose any creatures because all the damage Shieldred and Bloodtithe Harvester and Fable are going to deal is going to be prevented, but your creatures still get to deal damage to your opponent's creatures. So this can be an absolutely huge blowout in the right matchup. Like if you're up against decks with red and black creatures, the like pseudo fog ability, if you got a big board, can be a one-sided wrath in some scenarios. We also got Glistening Deluge, and this one really leans into the color hate. So 3 mana sorcery, all creatures get -1/-1 until end of turn. Not that good. But creatures that are white or green get an additional -2/-2. So white or green creatures get -3/-3. So this is a card that I don't think you can main deck it unless the meta is very skewed towards white or green. Against red, blue decks, against black decks, this card is downright awful. Like giving stuff -1/-1 for 3 mana is just not worth it. On the other hand, there are certain matchups where this is going to be like 3 mana kind of win the game. Like against soldiers, this is pretty much a 3 mana hard wrath. Against any of the toxic decks, green, white, toxic, whatever, this is pretty pretty much wiping your opponent's entire board for 3 mana, which is ridiculous. So I don't think you can main deck this card. It's so bad unless you're up against green or white. But in a meta where there's some popular white decks, a lot of popular white decks, and green is sometimes paired with white in the toxic decks, this card can be an absolute blowout from the sideboard. Finally today, just some other lower rarity stuff. Nothing super ridiculous for Constructed, but some Convoke stuff. You never want to underestimate Convoke. Convoke always punches above its weight because it's just such a powerful mechanic, such a powerful way to ramp with any deck essentially, but mostly stuff that's going to be at home in limited. So anyway, kind of a short day today. It's the weekend, with spoilers slow down on the weekend, but still some really interesting stuff. I mean, in March of the Machines world, a slow day is a free 2020 trampler with ward, which is ridiculous. This set is so above the curve. It is so insane. So anyway, everyone, let me know what you think. What are you hyped for? What are you thinking about the set? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll be back either tomorrow or Monday, depending on how many spoilers we get, with more March of the Machines spoilers. So until then, have a great weekend and a wonderful day, and I will talk to you soon.